welcome to Seek Sustainable Japan. Today we are talking about Japanese politics, and we have the perfect person to help us navigate all the ins and outs and changes. We have Dr. Donna Weeks. Thank you so much for joining, Donna.
Thank you, JJ. It's great to be here again. Thank you.
How you doing today? How's the weather?
It's rainy. We're heading into summer, so it's humid and rainy and all the rest. So yeah, but we'll get by. It's what summer is here in the Southern Hemisphere. So.
Now, Donna, you joined us before the election, and we were talking about potential prime minister candidates, and you actually chose Ishiba, who ended up being chosen. How does that feel to be right?
Well, unusual. Yes, and look, it was less a prediction, as we were talking at the time, less a prediction and more of the candidates here who would actually be my pick, who would actually be the best. And that's, I'm just pleased they listened to our, broadcast at the time, obviously.
Obviously, yes.
No, it really was, winning down all the possibilities and things that, from a political scientist point of view, who would be of this lot, who would be the best. And so, yes, it wasn't so much a prediction, but just a kind of an educated guess, I guess. So, it was interesting. I think it surprised a lot of people. And I think what we saw immediately upon his election was the anger within the party that he had become elected president and onto prime minister. And my thought then was, all right, so he's now become prime minister, or will be prime minister, but he's going to have a very hard time because that opposition that he has within the party was incredibly visible on that day. I mean, the fact that Aso didn't applaud him or acknowledge him, or because Aso, I guess at the moment, is one of the kingmakers in the LDP. He was very much.
Takashi refused to join his cabinet.
That's
so
right.
There was obvious dissension within the power dynamics there, right?
So immediately I thought, okay, this is going to be tough. This is going to be difficult, but still thinking that, well, he is the person to override all these things. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting little time for him to, now that we've had the election as well. It's not a majority government, it's going to be minority government, which in this day and age, I think has its pluses. I think it's not necessarily a bad thing to have minority government, because it means there has to be actual negotiation between all interests and all parties to try and get something through. That can end up in compromise policies, but also it can end up in better policies as well. So we've had minority government here in Australia a few times, and at times it's meant better policy for everybody. So I'm not that concerned. Again, sort of in the political science way of thinking that it's going to be a dangerous time. Politically speaking of the internal political dynamics, it could be quite difficult, and that's something we might get onto a little bit later. What I've been thinking about those things.
Prime Minister Ishiba just made a speech, so we're going to talk about some of the key points under discussion in politics right now. Donna, you also wanted to mention that we've just lost a leader in political science in Japan.
I understand even this morning it hasn't been confirmed, but during the week there was an enormous fire in the apartment and the residence of parliamentarian Inoguchi Kuniko and her husband, as it was portrayed in the media, Inoguchi Takashi. Now, Inoguchi sensei, both of them I studied under when I was a student in Japan. Inoguchi Takashi sensei is one of our leaders in political science. I think any of us who've studied Japanese politics or international politics from a Japanese perspective will have at least read Inoguchi sensei's books. He was just prolific. He would engage genuinely in conversations with you as a graduate student and was very encouraging. And if it is, they still haven't formally identified the two bodies that were found in the apartment. But if it is true that we have lost Inoguchi Takashi sensei to this terrible tragedy, it's a moment for us, all of us who've come to Japanese politics this far, to at least stop and acknowledge his enormous contribution. He's multilingual, absolutely dedicated internationalist, international politics person, and for him to pass in this way is something we've all been reflecting on in the last few days. Of course, as I said, it's not officially confirmed, but it does appear that it won't be long before confirmation comes through. So my condolences to the family, to Inoguchi Sensei, Kuniko, and their daughter as well. Kuniko has become a long-standing LDP politician over the years, which surprised us a little at the time. I guess we weren't anticipating she'd become a member of the Liberal Democratic Party, but she has, and she continued. And I remember the day that she was elected, and Takashi Sensei was standing, with her, and she said, we're both political scientists. We want to bring the political science to politics in a way that improves politics, and that's something that, I think about all the time, is how can we as political scientists bring something to politics. So yes, very sad for us this week. So thank you for giving me that moment to acknowledge him. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. And you said personally you've had a chance to study under him when you were at Tokyo University. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, as a graduate student, but also just other opportunities. As I said, he came to Australia a few times and worked with him then. So yeah.
Well, hopefully all's not lost, and he's, connected to loads of his students like you who are continuing on with his ideas and legacy. So even if a lot of his writings and of course himself has been lost, hopefully there are people who will carry on with his knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the Prime Minister Ishiba's speech yesterday and some of the key topics. Of course, one of the top topics is about the military, and negotiating with the incoming president might be a big shift from the way things have gone so far. Japanese politicians and newspapers often refer to transactional Trump, that you have to give him something personally to get something. And that's the way they're kind of getting ready to negotiate with him. But the idea of Japan's military as a key position in Asia, which is an advantage for the US as well as important for Japan, to improve the lives of the self-defense force, maybe change the role of the self-defense force a little bit, to improve cybersecurity, and to improve joint management of US bases, which would be a real big shift. But these are things he mentioned in his policy speech. Anything to add there?
Yeah, look, this was his policy speech that he made yesterday in Parliament. So again, our talk today is quite timely. This was people have different views about the value of this speech. I used to always go through them with my students just to say, look, whatever you think about this is what the Prime Minister aspires to. This is what he's thinking, and it's worth our while then having a look at what he said. Now, quite often a lot of it doesn't get through, and a lot of people are critical, and they say but he didn't detail anything and all that. But that aside, I think it still gives us a broad outline, which is all it's intended to do, a broad outline of where he's going. And as you said, obviously all nations, particularly in our area of the Asia Pacific, are going to have to how shall we say this, come to terms and negotiate with the incoming presidency in the United States. Now, certainly that there has been a Trump presidency previously, and as you say, it's incredibly transactional. The touch points for us, I guess, in this region will be how President Trump the incoming President-elect Trump will negotiate again with Kim in North Korea, and what that will that can be an incredibly unstable. He thinks it's very stable, but it can be an incredibly unstable influence in the region. Now, Ishiba on that on that level, Ishiba has a long history in politics in the defence portfolio, and this is going to be quite significant. As I was reviewing his history in preparation again for today, he was, before the Defence Ministry became a ministry, and it was just the agency, so it was just a self-defence agency, so not quite the level of ministry, but still quite significant. The Environmental Agency was like that once too, elevated later to ministerial and cabinet level status. He was the one who effectively gave the okay for the self-defence forces to go to the Middle East on the grounds of defending Japan. So in a way, he kind of started not started, but pushed along or gave some incentive to the changing nature of the self-defence forces. Now this is another area of work that I'm writing about at the moment. So it's quite significant. Now, I don't think he wants to see the self-defence forces go completely fully offensive, a full force as such. I think he's, from what I've read, what he says, he still sees it as a self-defence force. But yes, the role has to be different. Now, what this means in terms of the region and also in his negotiations with Trump. I mean, as you say, Trump really just thinks in terms of negotiations and what are the best outcomes for him, or in this case, the United States. So I think that's going to be very problematic. Ishiba, on the other hand, has also said that he wants to maintain, those important relations with China. And I guess in the region for us, it's this relationship with China that all of us have to negotiate, along with Taiwan and what its situation will be at the moment. And so when we talk about regional security, there are lots of things that are coming into the mix. Now, Australia also has a role in this. Australia and Japan, of course, are very much dominated by the alliance with the United States. The defence relationships, and this is a little concerning for me, but the defence relationships between Australia and Japan are on the increase in terms of strengthening and training the Japanese. Even now for me, it's hard to continue to say self-defence forces. I've long been a supporter of the idea of self-defence forces, and always correcting students if they say, the Japanese army or the Japanese military. But even for me, it's getting harder to hold up the pretext that it's a self-defence force. From next year, more Japanese troops will be coming to Australia to train with the Australians under this AUKUS. Again, whether or not AUKUS remains, which is this newish alliance between Australia, the United States and the UK, essentially to build submarines, nuclear-powered submarines into the 2040s, but they're also enmeshing it in ideas of greater military cooperation and so on. It's a very bad idea, and I have spoken about it elsewhere as just not the right sort of response to the present security environment. That said, it is going to draw Australia and Japan into a stronger defence alliance of sorts. Now, whether or not Ishiba is going to go along with that and allow that, it's a little bit hard to know. I think he'll, as we've discussed before, I think Ishiba has been in politics long enough and been on the outer of general mainstream Liberal Democratic Party politics to be enough of his own sort of politician. And I think, his pragmatism will come in, and his experience in these things. I mean, one thing that struck me through all this, not getting the majority government and waiting for the outcome of the vote for him to be Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago in Parliament, he was very unflustered by it. It's like, well, this is just part of the game. This is how it goes. And that to me gave us some good indications, I think, about how he might be pursuing his prime ministership. So, as I said, I think he's going to be, well, like anybody now, dealing with a Trump administration in this region. Again, I'll see an opportunity for greater cooperation amongst at least the so-called democratic nations in our region. That would be Australia and South Korea, Japan. I still have optimism that we should be engaging more with China, not sort of resisting or setting up China as some kind of, something to oppose. I think more engagement there is incredibly important. I mean, trade for Australia with China is just incalculable, and to try and make China the enemy is just makes no sense. And so it may be
with Japan and Australia, I
with
think
Japan and Australia, yep.
with America stepping in with these big tariffs against China. Japan and Australia are going to be more important trading partners with China, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Especially for big industries like automobiles for Japan and China. One thing, Prime Minister Ishiba talked with President Xi at the G20 in Brazil this month, and he talked about the talks being biting. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it doesn't sound that good, But the border for Japanese visitors to China just reopened. They do seem to have, off and on. It's always a tricky relationship. But any recent developments on the positive or kind of difficult side you've noticed?
Yeah, again, going back to his speech yesterday, he acknowledges, Ishiba acknowledges the sensitivity of the relationship with China in terms of domestic politics in Japan vis-a-vis China. He's not been one to visit Yasukuni Shrine, for example, because he knows that it offends and upsets, as he said, the Chinese and South Korean neighbours, and kind of why would you do that? So again, he, in contrast to some more recent prime ministers, and I guess I'm thinking Abe and others, instead of deliberately being provocative towards neighbours, I think he comes with an understanding that, we don't have to be necessarily great friends or great mates, as we'd say here, but we have to work together, and we've got to find that way to work together. And that's more important than, always considering ourselves as enemy. And I think I was listening to a radio program this morning, actually, and it's quite true. We've lost the art of diplomacy, I think, in international relations, and international politics. And I think the notion that diplomacy isn't as important as showing you military muscle, and that, we gain power through military muscle. And this feeds into some of my work that I've been doing through, peace work and security communities and so on, is that we have to find ways and give politicians who want to go down that path the opportunity to step up, to be more diplomatic, and not diplomatic in any, fluffy sort of or superficial way, but an actual, these are our leaders. These are the people who are representing us, who should be able to talk face to face, quite, confrontingly when it needs to be, but also with a view to, as is my catchphrase, making the world a better place. That's why we hopefully have them there. And this is what I think some of the people who become leaders forget. I think sometimes the media doesn't like to, there's no confrontation in those sorts of ideas. It's we want to have, it's much simpler to say, China is our next enemy, our next Cold War opponent and things like that, rather than work through what our alternatives might in fact be. Now, Ishiba, despite his background as, former defence minister, and, I believe he makes, one of his hobbies is to make plastic models of all the, military things that he can find. I think he has a genuine interest in that, and I guess I'm saying this more in hope than anything from observation, but I think he'll be pragmatic enough, not to give away any of Japan's sovereignty on any of these things. And I think he will definitely be a different prime minister towards Trump than Abe was. I think what we will need, and I say this from an Australian perspective as well, is somehow our leaders to somehow stand up to Trump. So it's going to be critical over the next few years in terms of what happens. So whereas Abe sort of went in with trying to build a very personal relationship, I'm not sure that Ishiba is that type of politician and should, in fact, as he was saying, and as you said before, look at ways of building the Japanese military or self-defense forces in such a way that there can be a certain level of independence, but also nothing that's going to sort of combust the situation, I guess.
Just catching up with some links here.
Probably didn't answer your question directly, but
No,
it's
yeah,
always quite
absolutely.
interesting where he's headed.
I'm just adding some links for the pages that I'm showing. The official Prime Minister Ishiba page for the government, for example, really good to see all these official pages also have really good English equivalents, so that shows an outward international face of transparency for the government in Japan. I'm always encouraged by that.
Yeah. And they're very quick with those translations. And also I would say that Ishiba is he's upping his social media game. He's on Instagram quite regularly, and both in English and Japanese. And there's still a few tweaks he might want to make to his Instagram post, but he's there, and he's certainly giving it a good shot. So.
Now, some of the other things he talked about, a more domestic policy, like about social equity, giving aid to low-income families, giving people all income support for energy prices, electricity and energy prices, as well as rural revitalization. One of his key pillars of his campaign to become prime minister was to give more emphasis and more funding back into the rural areas of Japan.
Well, certainly, let's take that last point first, because he does come from Totori. He was born in Tokyo, but basically grew up in Totori, where his father was governor at one stage, and so on. So his electoral district is in Totori, which is probably one of the poorer and least populated prefectures in Japan. He has held variously ministries that include rural revitalization as well. So this is not just something he does and says because he thinks it's a good thing. It's again something he actually has lived experience. Well, not he himself, but he comes from an area where he's probably watching this rural decline and the importance of doing that. Notwithstanding, I think it's Totori that has the sand dunes, which are very popular with tourists at the moment. So there's a little bit there for Totori that he can draw on. So
it's the least visited prefecture in Japan, apparently, domestic tourism or international, and it's a beautiful place.
It is.
They could probably do with some revitalization. I have done some consulting trips there to Totori, and they have so many charming things. If anybody knows Gege no Kitaro, they've got a famous street for that manga artist. You can go to Suna Bucks, so sand coffee shop instead of Starbucks, which is fun. And also the sand dunes is a huge draw for the area, but you can ride a camel through the sand dunes. So it's quite unexpected as well sometimes in Japan, right?
Yes. Well, you can ride camels in the northern part of Australia too.
Oh, can you? Wow.
Yeah.
So talking social equity and building support systems for lower income earners and things, how has Ishiba shown through his career kind of fighting for the working class or?
Well, I guess and part of his speech yesterday is what's become a bit of a term at the moment, what is it, the 103, 10,000, it comes down to around 10 or $11,000 Govt wall. So this income level where taxes start happening, and I think this has become a bit of a catchphrase, the 103万円の壁, whereupon they want to make some changes there so that taxes come in a little bit after that, which would help people. To raise that limit, it's sort of like say kabe, but I guess it's like a ceiling, what we would say in English, a ceiling is how to get over that for people who, want to earn more money without the taxes. So adjusting the taxation there, I think, will be something of a policy issue that he will take up over. And this is again where a couple of the opposition parties are putting a lot of pressure on him. And this is where I say having minority government can in fact result in better outcomes in some ways, in that parties will do what needs to be done in order to get legislation passed. I noticed right early on in his becoming Prime Minister, he has talked about getting at least the hourly wages raised. And this has, of course, been a big issue in Japan over many, many years. I mean, something I've noticed sort of going backwards and forwards is the way that...
to raise it to 1,500 per hour, right? Within the next 10 years, like incrementally?
Incrementally, yeah, it'll be incremental because I guess he's got to allow for what companies and employers can do. But at least he's signalled that again, and I think this is, it's one thing to signal it and it's another to actually establish it. But again, I think, the opposition parties would be in favour of, most of the opposition parties would be in favour of that sort of initiative as well. And so he's possibly more likely to be able to get that through than, there'd be more opposition within his own party, I would expect, than he will get from the opposition party. So he certainly has said very early on in his term that is one thing that he will be doing. And as you say, the various assistance packages for energy and so on that will be coming through, because it was terrible to see, reports of people not switching on their air conditioning in summer because it was taking up, costing too much and things like that, and people say, well, I didn't use my air conditioning in Tokyo because I was able to open windows and doors and get a nice breeze through. So, I minimised my air conditioning use, but, not everybody can do that. And people choosing between keeping cool versus, the cost, that's a terrible decision that people have to make. And so I think for me, it is partly a government response. If we talk about politics being for good, it's something that, the government should be looking at to alleviate those difficulties in these sorts of times. And I guess we'll get the reverse as winter comes on. People won't be turning on the heaters because of the costs, and that will result in greater social disabilities and death and so on. So, these are the sorts of things that we want our politicians really to be thinking about and acting on, and making that a reality. So I think, Ishiba's he's certainly floating those ideas, and I think he certainly does see that as important. So
And speaking of energy, that's also one of the key things he talked about yesterday. But in his prime minister campaign to become prime minister and president of the party, he was talking about wanting to reduce nuclear energy and wanting to increase renewable energy, including geothermal, which hasn't really developed much in Japan yet. But I was looking at MEDI, the Ministry of Environment and Industry, and they have a subsidy, a new feed-in tariff to support businesses or individuals who want to use renewable energy, including geothermal, to get a higher payback when you sell it to the grid, and then that helps you pay it off quickly. So that's nice to see that that's back.
Yep.
That was something that stopped for a while. Any other points on the energy issue that you
Well,
wanted to touch on?
yeah, I mean, I think you raise, an important point. In Australia also, we've got a faction in our politics here that wants to bring in nuclear power, and everyone's saying, but wait, Australia has, it's the sunniest country in the world, solar and wind and the natural resources that we do have. They're there, they're working, this is all powered, talking to you today is all powered by the solar panels on my roof.
Me
And
too. Me too. Fantastic. Other sides of the other countries, but still same policies work, right?
exactly. And so Australia has an abundance of sun, so solar panels make sense. Japan has the geothermal resources. That makes extraordinary sense too, and that's something that the solar panels, as you go out on the trains into the country in Japan, you see, farmlands and so on covered in the panels. I think there's really no need to be pursuing nuclear energy anymore, and I think this is a really good thing to see. Ishiba going down that path. I mean, he has stated that on a slightly different angle that Japan should be able to be nuclear ready, weapons wise, but that's quite separate from, the nuclear power plants and so on. And, as we've seen time and again with Japan and earthquakes, why would you put, nuclear power plants in those very unstable, because they've basically got to be on the coast because of the amount of water that they use. And so, to me, for a long time in Japan, geothermal has been the obvious option. And again, we all need to be, all countries everywhere need to be looking at these alternative ways to power ourselves. Geothermal in Japan, solar in Australia. It's really good sense. So if he's able to pursue that, I think that will be another. And again, that's something that people can keep pressing him on. You said, you can do this, you can do that. So I think
You just
it's good to hear
briefly touched on one of the issues that I think is worth discussing about nuclear weapons and his stance on being kind of asked directly what his stance on nuclear weapons is. Now, Prime Minister Kishida, who was from Hiroshima, who has just stepped down this year, he was very clear against nuclear weapons. But Ishiba seems to have a little bit of a more cautious take on saying it one way or the other. Is that right?
Pretty much. I mean, I think he wouldn't. He does. I don't think he wants Japan to have nuclear weapons, but I don't think he's going to rule it out entirely, which is a kind of a bit of a shame. He'd like to see more and more countries moving towards the elimination of nuclear weapons and not having to be in this situation of walking on both sides of the fence, as it were. And I guess, what would you say? In a way, until the major powers that have all the nuclear weapons are prepared to step back and say, actually, no, we're not going to have these. While ever that possibility is around, in political, international relations theory, any sort of theories that you look at, people are going to hedge one way or the other with this. So, Australia going into this AUKUS deal to have nuclear powered, not nuclear installed submarines, but nonetheless, that we continue down this path, I think is really something that we all have to, is in great demand for a rethink. Now, Ishiba, again, being the pragmatist that I think he is sort of saying, well, we don't want them, but we don't want to not have them. And, let's face it, when Kishida did come in and coming from Hiroshima and saying all these things about no nuclear weapons and all the things he could have done as Prime Minister, and he didn't do, which just led to more disappointment. I mean, I remember being in Japan, in Tokyo, when Obama spoke in Hiroshima in 2016, and I think we might have covered this in our last discussion, but Obama was there in Hiroshima. It had the same effect on him that it had on me when I first visited Hiroshima. It changed the way I did my politics, my visit to Hiroshima. And as I said to students, if there was one person at that time in the world who could have said, I've just been through the museum here, and he made the cranes and all the rest. There was one person who could have said, right, we're going to stop this. It was Obama. He could have done it. Now, it's always one of those puzzles that those of us in this field have to keep investigating, keep engaging with. What stops these leaders from saying no nuclear weapons? This is absolutely critical. You can show them Hiroshima and Nagasaki time and time again, and they'll say all the right things, but what's their action going to be? So I think until we have that major shift, people like Ishiba, leaders like Ishiba, because of the environment they're in, and it might also be, again, his pragmatism, speaking to certain parts of his party as well as to, to the electorate, and seeing that Kishida said that but didn't do anything, and that didn't help either. I think it's sort of his pragmatic approach. I think underlying that sense is that he wouldn't go for nuclear weapons, but for all sorts of reasons at this stage wouldn't rule it out. But yeah, that's a big question, isn't it? I don't know.
And it's a big question now, like the Nobel Peace Prize Committee saying when they gave the prize to the Hibakusha survivors group, that it seems like once again nuclear weapon use is imminent in our world. And so it's a really key issue to be talking about, and not increasing our nuclear arsenals, but maybe not giving them up until the enemies are also willing to give it up is a practical solution. Maybe it's a horrible thing to being in Hiroshima, doing tours in Hiroshima. This is not the same as any other bomb. This is not just a more powerful bomb. This affects people for generations. The stigma, as well as all the damage physically and mentally, emotionally, and to the cities. It's something that I'm proud of, being in Hiroshima and being able to welcome people who are willing to take in what happened here in hopes it never happens again, right?
That's right. Yeah. And, same reason I keep going to Hiroshima and visiting you, of course, and working with you there. But it is, for me, absolutely critical that I go back, from time to time to remind myself why I'm doing. And I always come away, when I'm leaving on the Shinkansen to head back to Tokyo, there's always that sense, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. It has that level of impact. In fact, behind me, you can see my Hiroshima peace scarf, which I wear here quite a lot, and wore it yesterday to a gathering. And I explain to people, I take the opportunity to explain to people what it is that I'm wearing, why I wear it, why I believe in what I'm doing, is because of that. And I'm just one person, but together it's like a sustainability, isn't it? I'm just one person not buying a plastic bottle of water, taking my water bottle instead, but if we all did it. So it is this very much, and this is getting back towards the political philosophy I'm developing, it's this bottom-up approach that is absolutely critical. These people that we focus our attention on, the presidents and the prime ministers, really are just there as our representatives. They're not they're not to be there to tell us what to do, but they're there doing what we tell them to do, and we've got to make that shift around the table, I think.
Yeah. Now, this last election, the ruling party did lose some seats, and other parties kind of stepped up in power a little bit. Can you give us an overview of what the situation is?
Yeah, look, this was a really interesting result, wasn't it? But one we've seen before in Japan. I mean, we always talk about the LDP as having been in power effectively since 1955, when the two parties came together, the Liberals and the Democrats, except for a couple of opportunities. Now, what this current period will remind me of the most is probably around about 1993 to 1995, 1996, where the LDP did go out of power briefly. There was this enormous coalition of parties in government trying to move things through. But nonetheless, some significant things happened then. And I think critically for us today, Ishiba was a part of that. He was originally in the LDP. He left the LDP to join some of these reformist parties, more progressive parties, trying to fix the system in the end. Obviously, as it all sort of started to fall to pieces, the pragmatism in him made him rejoin the LDP. And, this is going back, it's 30 years ago now, isn't it? It's a long time ago. It's a long time I've been studying politics. I think that will stay with him, and how things can be maybe done differently to get that different sense. And so I keep reflecting on that period now as I look at the outcome of this most recent election. I mean, one of the good things to see was that there was an increase in women politicians up to 73, I think it was, which is great. I was really interested to see in terms of the number of seats, the comeback by the Rikken Democrats, the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan. Now that was a really big comeback. Obviously, it really spoke to the electorate being quite angry with the LDP and the money scandals, the connection with the Unification Church. One really interesting signifier of this was the electorate that I lived in Tokyo, in the northwestern suburbs of Tokyo, which had been held by Shimamura Hakobun, who'd been in for almost as long as I'd been living in the area from, I think he came in the 1990s. He was defeated. Now he was considered that part of Tokyo has always been very strongly Liberal Democrats and Komeito, so quite a conservative area. And for Shimamura to be defeated by the Constitutional Democrat candidate, who I will disclose here, I did spend some time with him and attending his, he worked very hard in the electorate over the last 3 years, really appearing at all the social, political gatherings that the people had and so on. He really worked very hard to raise his profile. He was actually formerly a secretary of Ishihara Shintaro way back. So he too has gone from the Liberal Democrats and come across to the Constitutional Democrats. So that was an interesting sign for me that change had come through. Now, of course, the Constitutional Democrats didn't get quite the numbers to win this time, and certainly you couldn't pull together a coalition of the opposition parties, but I expect that it will give them some influence in the politicians, in the policies to come through. So it was certainly an interesting outcome. Exciting for people like me who like to watch this stuff.
Yeah. We've got an interesting question about, is it okay, morally speaking, to advocate for elimination of nuclear weapons, but then be under the nuclear umbrella of another country? So talking about Japan and allowing America forces to be the Japan military, basically, and having nuclear weapons as the American forces here, right? It's been a debate for many years in Japan, an ongoing, very controversial topic, and a really good point. Thank you for adding that, Alando.
Yes, I would say really, it's a really good point to make. And Australia is in the same situation. We're kind of under the nuclear umbrella too, and any US naval ships coming into port here, they can neither confirm nor deny. Australia is essentially anti-nuclear on that level. That will change, of course, but they're on can neither confirm or deny, allowed to allowed to come into port. I was actually in a protest back as a third-year student at university when one of the American ships came into the port in Brisbane, protesting that. So I've been doing this a long time. So, but it's absolutely a valid. And thank you, Alando. That's a really important point to make.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. talking a little bit about the scandal that made the
Which one?
whole upheaval. So the abolishment of political funds. He talked about it in his policy speech, perhaps creating a third-party institution to oversee political funding, to add a layer of transparency. How likely is that to happen? I mean, this would be a good fix, it seems like.
Well, again, this is a policy proposal he's throwing out there. Obviously, he can say that. How will he implement it? You know, funnily enough, we've just had a similar piece of legislation try to get through the Australian Parliament here, which everyone could see it was in fact about entrenching the power of the two main parties. It wasn't about making political donations more transparent. It would, if it had got through. In the end, they pulled it at the end of the week, to be continued, as it were. This idea of giving transparency in political donations was actually going to crush the opportunity for independents and minor parties. And we've seen a real groundswell in independents and minor parties in Australia recently rising to Parliament here. So again, politicians will say on the one hand they're all about the interests of the electorate, but when it comes to these sorts of things and staying in power, it becomes all about them and how can we stay in power. Now, if there is in any way, shape or form something in this proposed legislation, this third party body that will diminish the opportunity of the LDP staying in power, you can bet they'll be opposed to it. If that transparency helps the opposition parties in perhaps being able to be more transparent and get more donations for them and give them a better chance to perhaps get into power, they'll be for it. But anything that diminishes, the party's opportunity to continue along their merry way, I think it'll make it very, very difficult. It's a hopeful and promising piece of legislation. And this is where Ishiba's negotiation skills with the opposition will be really, really important to pull this through, I think. Yeah.
You mentioned how Prime Minister Ishiba, is active on social media. Now that brings up a really recent scandal from Hyogo, how the politician was using social media influence to win the election. So this might be something that the national government also has to touch on, about how social media is used by politicians in terms of disinformation or feeding the populism fever, well, we saw what happened
We saw what happened,
in
didn't we?
other countries.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Weird. I mean, when I say he's becoming prominent in social media, I generally follow him on Instagram, and it's still at that he's trying hard level. There's nothing about his posts that would be influential or anything, but he's there and he's trying to be. There's a couple of, if I were his social media manager, there's a couple of tweaks I'd get him to think about to sort of help it along. But he is there. I mean, I guess he's not that much older than me, but he's, approaching 70. It's a new world for him. I mean, I'm sure he's got a social media manager, but he's still getting there and he's showing himself as what's he doing as Prime Minister and all the rest. But yes, I mean, your point about the Hyogo election and the way social media has now become such a big part of politics, as we saw in the United States as well. This is a big problem we're going to have to confront. We're going to see it in Australia as well. Australia, I know that it got in the news in Japan as well. They've just passed legislation to ban under 16s using social media. Now, we don't know the detail. We don't know. Yeah, it's there. Yeah. We just don't understand how it's going to work. Am I, as a 60-year-old, going to have to put my proof of age, to use my Instagram? Or they said, oh, no, it won't be for you. Well, how will they know that I'm a 60-year-old, not a 16-year-old.
It's an interesting policy to see
Yeah,
how it actually rolls
yeah,
out, right?
yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But the idea that any politician, older politician in Japan, is using social media in a way to connect with voters,
Mm, mm,
in theory, that's a good thing, right?
yeah, yeah,
But we've seen in other countries, including the American election, how that can be abused, right?
yep, yep. And and the Hyogo one as well. There was some really fine lines there about a company that was employed, I understand, to do the social media. Um, what's going to become of social media? We often talk about in politics the role of what's now become mainstream media, or the more orthodox media. But we're also going to have to shift our focus to social media as well, because it's um, you know, and I don't think Australia's legislation this week, the government's legislation this week, is going to be the answer to it either. There's nothing about politics in that legislation. It's about supposedly protecting young people from the health and other dangers of social media. But and you can't ban social media during campaigns. They've got laws about not having um, ads so many hours or days before an election. Those sorts of things you can kind of legislate. You can't legislate what we all hold in our hands, and add to all the time. So, I mean, his use of social media is at that informational level. This is what I'm doing. This is how things are happening. But then, of course, as soon as you put something up like that, and he allows comments, and so people will make those comments. And I think it's out of that, never read the comments, they say, except these wonderful ones here that we get. It's for me, it's a question of if we have to look at how we're commenting and how we're engaging with our politics.
I
Because
think that's right. And having decency standards
that's
or
right.
information accuracy standards,
Mm,
being able to debunk or show how something that was posted by someone influential is
mm,
not accurate
yeah,
in mainstream media and
mm,
on the social platforms
mm,
as well, to
mm,
give
mm.
users who that is their 100% of intake of information. That's dangerous if it's not debunked, if it's not connected to reality, right?
Mm, mm.
That's going to be a really interesting conversation going forward.
Yeah. Well, it
We
comes back
just
to us as well. Just to say, why would you? What makes you put something up that's a lie?
Yeah.
Think about ourselves as you're sitting there about to put something in the comments. Why are you doing that?
Yeah.
And we have to ask ourselves. We have to have as much self-reflection as reflecting on others, I think.
Absolutely. And when it's done on purpose to persuade and it's not accurate and it's disinformation, there should be some consequences of that, right?
Yeah, not becoming
Just
president.
one more point I wanted to
Mm.
touch on. We're less than 8 minutes
Yeah.
now. So one of the topics he talked about at the policy speech was creating a disaster prevention
Mm,
agency. So in light of what is still ongoing in the Noto Peninsula after the earthquake, devastating earthquake that happened there at the beginning of this year, one of the key things he's talking about is create a efficiency response network
mm,
to go into action quicker when we have natural disasters. Of course, Japan is historically very prone to
mm,
natural disasters. It's very likely to happen again. Having a quicker response team, it seems like
mm.
a really good idea.
Well, as we're saying off air, it's kind of surprising that they haven't done this. And I must say, all the years I've been in Japan, I've often been astounded. When I visited Tohoku, and people were still living in the temporary housing 7 years later, and the response, I guess, is considered and careful, but they really do need to be faster. And I guess it does come down to a sort of a lack of a place to coordinate these things. I mean, if we go back to the earthquake in Kobe, which was the first time really that the self-defense forces were able to be used in a domestic sense for assistance, emergency assistance. But the debate that went on about that beforehand, how many lives were lost? And when we talk about the self-defense forces and the role of this kind of core of people, this to me is what we can get greater value out of the use of this kind of self-defense group there that's ready to move. It's got nothing to do with war or anything like that. I think of that here in Australia, where we have bushfires. We're heading up to a horrible bushfire season. It's the same sort of thing. And to me, this is where Australian and Japanese forces should be cooperating in the region, in times of emergency and things like this. And so again, it's kind of surprising they haven't sort of pulled this together. But I think Ishiba, again, with that self-defense, the defense ministry background, living in a regional or a rural area, possibly susceptible to these sorts of disasters, I think this is, again, one that if he can get that through will be a really huge plus. And again, a model in a way for others to look at and to emulate too. The forces are already there. The bodies are already there to use in the self-defense forces. So putting them in that sort of positive light rather than, are they a standing army ready to go to fight, I think would be a big plus in accepting their role.
Yeah. So those were the main issues that I picked up on from the policy speech yesterday. Anything else that we haven't touched on? We've got about 5 more minutes.
Well, look, I mean, at the end of it, he basically said, and I am just reading from his speech, so forgive me for looking off camera, but largely what he wants to do, and I know that politicians say these sorts of things as part of their rhetoric, but he has a genuine sense of wanting to re-engage the polity to rebuild their trust, and somehow coming from him, coming out of his mouth, I don't know why, it just seems really quite genuine. And I think he holds all sorts of scars from his past political experience that I think will bring this to the fore. And again, the opposition parties talk about rebuilding trust. They did this in the 1990s as well. This isn't the first time it's happened. It's always about rebuilding trust. But I think he has a genuine sense of wanting to do that. And so I think, if he were given the space to do it, it would be really good. I think, unfortunately, there's still the opposition from within his own party that's going to make it difficult. And that's going to be some of his greatest hurdles to overcome. So people are already saying, he's not going to last 6 months, or, we're going to change again. And this brings me to this idea that I've been, that I'm working on now, this idea of a political ecosystem, and how do we make our politics more sustainable. I mean, a lot of it comes from working with you about sustainability and thinking about how do we make our world more sustainable. And certainly in the way that you are showing, or you're showing the way with all your guests, for me as a political scientist, it's like, well, actually, this is what we should be doing in politics as well. As I said before, each of us at the ground level doing one little bit at a time, all bringing it together, can make for a more sustainable politics. And that means that the media shouldn't be focusing on the unimportant things. Like, there's been a lot of focus this week on Ishiba and how he eats an onigiri, or, the fact that he looked a little bit disheveled when he was, these very superficial things that the media zeroes in on. That then becomes the discussion on social media. Politics is like an ecosystem. It's not just the leaders. It's not just the media. It's not just us going along to vote whenever we feel like it. We have to be a part of it all the time, not in a political sense, but thinking of it as an ecosystem, as you do with sustainability. How can we not just sustain a better world, but a better politics as well? And we've all got a responsibility to do that, I think. And thank you for working, for being able to work with you over the years, because it's really contributed to how I've come to think about how we can make things better. Because we could have this conversation next year with a new prime minister. We'll be talking about the same things, and that's not necessarily a good thing. It's like we want to be talking about our prime ministers or our presidents who've actually enacted policies that are going to be good for us, that are going to be good for the world, that are going to, get rid of nuclear weapons and things like that, all that sort of thing. So we need a sustainable environment. We need to have that sustainable environment. We need a sustainable political ecosystem. And I think we all have to contribute to that. So you'll hear me banging on about that from here on in, I think. So.
That is a fantastic place to leave it, right at the hour mark. Thank you so much, Dr. Donna Weeks. So much insight there. Really, I think for me, the big takeaways from today's discussion, a little bit of a positive view on the diplomacy that Prime Minister Ishiba brings to the position right now, and the potential for positive changes as we go into 2025 in terms of all the key issues. And there's so many. I really appreciate your point of view and all of your many years of experience looking at Japanese politics. So thank you so much for joining.
No, thank you. Really appreciate it. Thanks, JJ.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and fabulous comments and questions. If you're watching this in replay, of course, you can add your comments and questions below, and we will respond. Have a great day, everyone. And peace seems like a perfect thing to end on. Take care.